I'm sorry we don't have George Will to be your wingman today. And he truly would be your wingman because you've written the book of the moment.
Well, you said it, not I.
Well, when you wrote this book, and tell me if this is wrong, but the way I read it, you wrote it because you were prompted. I mean, you've been a pollster in this space for a very long time, one of the smartest pollsters. Your firm, Echelon Insights, which you founded with Kristen Soltis Anderson, who's a friend of FREOPP, a member of our board of advisors. You've been following the space for a long time, but you seemed, as far as I could tell, to be prompted by some of the remarkable results that came out of the 2020 and 2022 elections, which started to signal that there was something really interesting going on in the electorate.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the story of the 2020 election is oftentimes, I think misinterpreted. So obviously it was an election which Donald Trump lost, but he lost by much less than expected. And a big part of that reason it was much closer than people expected because you had a pretty big shift of Hispanic voters, of Asian voters in many different parts of the country his way. And overall, he just did a much better job of holding on to the working class across racial lines than I think people expected going into the election. This had tremendous consequences for 2024 because his ability to keep things close, I think, increased his claim, right, to as somebody who could come back. Obviously, he said all sorts of things about how he actually won the election. But this was plausible to some folks because it had been extremely close in only a few states. So that mini realignment we saw in 2020 really fundamentally reshaped the landscape we saw coming into 2024.
And why do you think that happened? The conventional wisdom in 2016 was that Trump was this very polarizing guy who was going to drive minorities away from the GOP into the Democratic Party, and the opposite happened. What explains that?
Sure. I mean, look, I think the issue set was very different in 2020, but I think one of the things that should have been a red flag to maybe some people on the left about the efficacy of identity politics as a mobilization strategy for this quote unquote coalition of the ascendant or rising American electorate, the groups, primarily non-white voters, young voters, single women, whose votes during the Obama era they felt were going to mean a lasting majority for Democrats in election after election after election. So not only does Trump in 2016 really have focused directly on that sort of white working class voter in the upper Midwest and aims directly at them, but he really does no worse among Hispanic voters. He improves a couple points among African American voters, despite virtually the entire Democratic campaign being waged on this idea that Trump was this uniquely horrific figure, especially in terms of racial equality. He's a xenophobe. He's a misogynist. All of these names they called him, didn't really seem to have very much of an effect in that campaign. So the 2020 race, that race was waged a lot less on questions of immigration. Right, immigration was a centerpiece of Trump's 2016 campaign, and it was really the COVID election. Well, what was happening during the COVID time period? What you had was high-income, college-educated voters who were able to safely work from home during the pandemic. Meanwhile, you have working class voters, many of them Hispanic, many of them African American, who had to go to work and whose jobs were really on the front lines and who really hurt the most by these pandemic lockdowns. And in Trump, they saw somebody who was fighting to get them back to work. I went to the Rio Grande Valley, the place in South Texas where obviously we've seen huge swings over the last 2 election cycles, and talked to people there. A big factor there is, you really have a community that, really by any measure of economic statistics, is towards the bottom of income, bottom of education, some of the poorest counties in the United States, but have really seen an economic boom due largely to oil and natural gas in Texas over the last decade. And so the perception was Trump is really somebody who is fighting for my job, fighting to keep the economy open. And that was really the floodgates started to open in 2020.
Yeah, and that's the other piece of your thesis. The one side of the coin is that the electorate is becoming less racially polarized, and that there's going to be competition for all voters, regardless of race and ethnicity. The other side of the coin is that we're seeing more polarization on the basis of educational attainment, specifically college versus non-college.
Yeah, and I think the big distinction that people made in 2020, or sorry, in 2016 specifically, was white educational polarization. It was really this phenomenon, was exclusively limited to white voters who are very different than non-white voters in terms of being much more ideological, seem to be much better sorted in terms of, if you have center-right policy views on, or if you have cultural instincts or various views that lean to the right, that's a pretty good indicator if you're a white voter that you're going to vote Republican, and vice versa for the left and Democrats. So there was this huge trend of educational sorting, but it was really only among whites. In 2020, that's when we start to see it break down, right? And we see it break down, and we see it break down further in 2024, where there's this huge shift among specifically non-white working class voters in this election. So what's happening? Well, what's happening is the non-white working class is starting to vote more like the white working class. And it's a story, this is a story about groups becoming, I think, more, becoming more part of the mainstream of American society, right? I think you had a very specific brand of politics, a very specific kind of politics in the Black community, in the Latino community, where you had many people who maybe had conservative views on specific issues, but that didn't map to how they voted. And there was a sense of group interest politics, group interest identity, and those things that had bound them to the Democratic Party, that sense of group interest, group interest politics or social pressure or social norms binding to the Democratic Party no longer seem to apply as much. And so we're seeing what I think is not just educational polarization, but ideological sorting across the electorate.
One of the things that's interesting about 2024 is that, we've described how Trump outperformed or relative to expectations or relative to 2020 or 2016 among minorities and the sorting by education. But what's interesting is he won all 7 of the battleground states. The senatorial candidates in those states, actually Democrats won, I want to say 6 out of 7 of the contested seats. And in the governor's races, senators' races, the Republicans did not perform as well as Trump did. So how much of what your book is about and your thesis is Trump-specific versus a real realignment?
Well, I think there's specific factors in each individual race that dictate, why that happened. Certainly, Republicans heading into the election were not really expecting to flip anything but these deep red states, which speaks to I think them underperforming over the last several election cycles, particularly in these Senate and down ballot elections, and just particularly in 2022. But kind of the scar tissue of 2022 going into 2024, the assumption was we're probably not going to be able to pick up any of those really true battleground seats. Now it looks like they picked up one of those seats with Dave McCormick in Pennsylvania, pending obviously recount, but that seems pretty much in the bag for him. But I think that the circumstances of each individual elections, I think that Trump was a uniquely strong candidate this year for this moment, for this year, much stronger. He was a much stronger candidate than he was in 2016 and 2020. Kamala Harris was a weak candidate, despite the, I think, media narrative that she was the savior or the solution to all the Democrats' problems. In the end, she was the vice president in one of the most unpopular, one of the most unpopular administrations in recent history to run for re-election, one of the most unpopular incumbent administrations that have had to face the electorate. So I don't think she was able to overcome that. As a result, it was just a better environment, I think, in the presidential race than it was in some of these down ballot races. But you also just have several Democratic incumbents, right, who come from red and purple states that once that needed to be maybe dislodged for some of these realignment trends to really fully take hold in the Senate. And, that Republicans did chip away at that, so that now more of their candidates are going to have that incumbency advantage in those red states. And, I think a state like Montana, a state like Ohio, probably not going to be seriously contested moving forward.
Is it, you mentioned the unusual strength of Trump and the weakness of Harris. What would you say were the strengths? What was unusually strong about him this time around?
Well, I think the environment was just, and he had a message that fit the environment. But, when you have consistently wrong track in the high 60s, when you had voters in focus groups and surveys literally screaming it out like that the economy and the cost of living was really their predominant concern, and that this was something that they predominantly blamed on the incumbent administration. Even if they didn't have a very clear sense of what the policies were that led to the cost of inflation and the cost of living, there was a sense that the administration it happened on their watch, and they had no plan. They seemingly had no plan to fix it, and their really whole approach was to gaslight voters into saying that, well, the economy is really actually great. Mm-hmm. Your wages have gone up to compensate you for inflation, and so it was just a completely off-key message from both Biden and Harris.
And to what degree, one counter argument one could make is, well, Trump won the popular vote, which a Republican had not done in 20 years, but he only won it by like 1 to 1.5%. Well, I know we're still waiting for some California precincts to come in. So is it possible that we're overreading into this election what actually happened?
Sure. The danger, right, that is always the risk, right, after any election, right, that someone is going to overread their mandate. But nonetheless, I mean, I think he did something that nobody expected he could do, right? And throughout the entire campaign, I think the assumption was really Trump has a good chance to win the Electoral College, but there's almost no way he wins the popular vote, or he's a definite underdog in winning the popular vote. And so what can we say about the fact that he won the popular vote? I think that he made breakthroughs in communities that Republicans and voting blocs that Republicans no longer had been seen as having any chance in, like young voters. Both of the exit polls point to young voters being either close or within single digits, right? Which is astounding. You talk about 18 to 29-year-old voters who have been voting Democratic by 20 points over the last several election cycles. You had gains among unmarried voters and unmarried women, younger women, younger men, especially been talked about, but younger women also to some extent. So you had, I think, Trump really there was a conversation prior to the election, which was, Trump has this kind of low propensity voter coalition. He might bring out these people, or he might get support from people who may not vote. Well, it turns out that they vote, which is, I think, quite a surprising development for many people. It was something that, I think, and it upends, I think, the conventional wisdom, right, about high turnout favors Democrats and low turnout favors Republicans.
Yeah, that's an interesting inversion, at least for now. Yeah. Ezra Klein in the New York Times the other day described your book described you as the guy who predicted the 2024 election. What surprised you in the 2024 election, whether it's through the exit polls or the actual results?
Well, not a ton if I predicted it, right? No, but I think the breadth of this, right, was something that surprised me, and the young voter phenomenon specifically was something that I didn't, didn't write the book on generational politics. Kristen did that, called the selfie vote, where she predicted, and I feel like a lot of her predictions, or a lot of the things she talked about have also now come to fruition. But no, I think the cross-cutting nature of this shift, it being something that really touched. I think that this was, the key divide in this election was, between people who were basically pretty safe and secure, relatively safe and secure, whether by virtue of the fact that they had a college degree, by virtue of the fact that they were older and had plenty of retirement savings, by virtue of the fact that they were married and sort of, and had two incomes in a house, and those groups all swung less. All the other groups, the people who probably have been hit hardest by the economy, probably have been hardest by inflation, right? All of those groups swung towards Trump in a big way.
I mentioned in my opening remarks that the page will soon turn to 2028. We talked about the fact that it's not clear yet whether other Republicans will be able to have the same performance electorally that Trump has. On the other hand, there are people who argue that, well, Democrats should have lost by more if there had been a Nikki Haley running instead of Trump. So what's your sense of how these trends will play out in 2020? Obviously, it's candidate dependent to some degree, but just if there was the so-called the mythical generic Republican candidate running in 2020, and the mythical generic Democratic candidate, what would you expect to see?
I think it's a lot. It's going to depend on what this administration does. It's going to depend on what the outgoing popularity of this administration is. I think this will probably be an administration where it's been in office it's only had 4 years, even though it's a second term. It will only have 4 years to kind of reverse the actions of the Biden administration. So I think that it will frustrate. I think the initial kind of 2 terms and out dynamic that we see in American elections, where typically you have presidents who get elected and then reelected and have 2 continuous terms, and then kind of almost regardless of their performance, get turned out in favor of the other party. So I think that dynamic will be a little interesting to watch in 2028. But I think, if Trump is able to ultimately govern in a way that improves economic perception, minimizes the downsides of the well-known, chaotic aspects of his first term, then I think he has a chance, right, to leave to a potential successor a good platform, a good place from which to run. But part of the reason I, was able to, I wrote this book was not just because, okay, well, you had this one trend in one election, but that has now seemingly has been repeated in a second election. And I would count myself a little bit more skeptical that the same exact trends will continue a third election in a row, given that they very rarely continue even in a second election in a row. But I do think this trend is global. So you've seen it in Brexit, you've seen it in the rise of the populist right throughout Western Europe and a lot of countries, where you've seen an inversion of the party coalitions across the world, where you have high-income, high-status voters voting more for parties to the left, and lower-income, lower-status voters voting more for parties to the right. So I think the safe prediction I think I will make is the Republican Party has changed. It has changed. The voting base of the Republican Party has changed fundamentally. And if you have a candidate who thinks, we can just go back to the way things were before Trump, I think they're in for a rude awakening.
If you were to advise Democrats on what they should do to reverse some of these trends, what do you think they should do in a way that's consistent with their governing philosophy?
Well, I think that stylistically, it's more of a stylistic change. I think, yes, there is a substantive change that people have been talking about quite a lot these days in terms of, maybe Democrats need to do more to repudiate the cultural politics, the cultural left, the woke tendencies in their party. I think it's that plus somebody who can speak convincingly and with authenticity. I think Kamala Harris was severely lacking in any form of authenticity, almost uniquely so, for a politician, right? I mean, just seemed very, very below average in this category. And so I think that embracing somebody who is heterodox, both kind of substantively and stylistically, right, I think is in the same way that Trump was for Republicans. And I think that solves a lot of problems, right, that allows you to paper over, somebody who either has a more magnetic personality, seems more authentic, seems more relatable. If you don't necessarily want to solve all the, ideological or issue-based problems with the party, somebody like that can help you paper over them more successfully than I think Kamala Harris was able to.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience in a minute, but I want to ask you one last question on my end before we do that. And wait for mics. Raise your hand, and there'll be mics circulating so that we can get your question on the record for the cameras. And that is, you made a point of saying, look, I'm a pollster, I'm not a policy guy, but you did talk about some policy, you gave some policy advice to candidates in your book. And some of that was consistent with the FREOPP way of doing things in terms of a more working class agenda focused on how to help lower and middle income Americans. But there was one thing that I didn't love in your policy recommendations, and that was your piece of advice that Republicans should stop talking about entitlement reform.
Well, that's political. I mean, this is that's maybe the political advice. Clearly, it's going to need to happen. I think. Look, I mean, I think that this is really the very first thing. One of the very first things when Trump was signaling in 2016 that he's going to be a different sort of political animal. Obviously, talking about immigration very heavily. But the second big thing he talked about is, I'm not going to be like those Paul Ryan-style Republicans and cut your Social Security, right? I'm not going to do that. And that was just a consistent through line, I think, throughout his entire political run. And I think going back to your point about the Democrats, I mean, picking those sorts of fights, right, is important, right? Because these controversies can be very clarifying and can signal to voters that, yes, in fact, the party has changed. Maybe I should take a second look at this person, right, who is actively, shaking things up and upsetting the apple cart. As far as the substance, I agree with you, right? I agree with you that this is something that is absolutely over the next few years going to have to be dealt with. I think that, however, I think that, it's better, I think, from a legitimacy of the ultimate solution standpoint that, it gets done in a bipartisan fashion.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would say that you don't have to the degree that cutting Medicare and Social Security is understood to mean cutting people's benefits. Right. You don't have to do that. You can means test the benefits. You can reduce the cost of health care so that delivering the benefit is less expensive. There are lots of ways to make Medicare and Social Security more solvent that protect seniors. And I would say Paul Ryan tried to do some of that, but there's certainly more work to do there. All right, let's get to some questions. Okay, we got a hand up here in the front.
As you discussed the election, you very much focus on the economy and inflation. Interestingly, even in the New York Times, Rui Teixeira thought, well, this may have been more about cultural issues. You called it authenticity and style. Do you think the cultural issues played a big difference in this election, or would you dismiss them somewhat as stylistic?
I would say to the extent that Trump was able to, and I think he needed to, after the candidate switch, further the idea that Kamala Harris was maybe a little bit extreme on some of these issues by highlighting her past record, by highlighting her statements from her 2019 campaign. There's still a benefit, for the candidate who is perceived as more mainstream. And ironically, if you look at the public opinion data, that's been Trump over the last few election cycles, where he is actually perceived, because he has this sort of heterodox mix of views that are not necessarily do not necessarily map on to the party platforms pre-2016, that he has this superpower of being perceived as somebody who is both authentic and more moderate ideologically. So I think that he had to continue to press that advantage, but specifically, I think the extent to which these cultural issues were important in this race, it was specifically as a proof point as it related to Kamala Harris, to really convince voters that she was outside the mainstream.
Thank you. Good morning, and thanks for this beautiful conference. My question concerns the media. It looks as if mainstream media, New York Times, CNN, has kind of lost trust with the voters. I'm not sure if you polled them specifically, but did anything emerge from what you saw for voter trends and how they treated the media? And do you think the media will alter their position toward President Trump in the upcoming session?
Well, I think what we've started to see, at least when it comes to the elite media, you started to see a realization by outlets like the Washington Post that them really acting as an organ of the Democratic Party or an organ of the opposition to Trump really has started to backfire on them pretty spectacularly. And, even the ownership of these papers like Jeff Bezos being more reluctant to endorse a candidate because of this, obviously the declining institutional trust in the media, signaling that the more that they are seen even taking any kind of partisan stances as being toxic. So it does seem to be that there is going to be a change in the posture, I think, not only of the media, but a lot of groups of the opposition to Trump in his second term is going to look different than in the first term. The reaction to this election has been strangely quiet. On the left, I think all of the idea of we're going to have 1 million people marching on Washington the weekend of the inauguration, there's no sign of anything like that happening so far.
Right in the middle here.
Do
we got one over there? Okay,
I have
go
a
ahead.
question over here. Hi, Emma Ernst with the Heritage Foundation. Thank you, Patrick, for working with Heritage in late 2023 and early 2024 to identify who these unaffiliated Americans were. And congrats on your accuracy this past election and identifying who was up for grabs in this election. So you talked a little bit about Trump as a candidate versus us as a movement. How would you suggest that we as a movement continue to engage this working class across all racial groups, keeping in mind that only Trump can be Trump, and when people try to be Trump, it doesn't work? How can we as a movement better keep these groups in future elections?
That's a great question, and appreciated the chance to work with you all. I think that we can make too much of the fact that only Trump is Trump, right? So I think, if we replace Trump with generic Republican, right, that person would have let's say a more normal style coalition, but it would still look very, very different than the coalition we saw in 2012. So I think the foundation continues to be working class voters. And I think that, obviously there's a tendency, I think, on both sides, right, that, in terms of you're really kind of separating how we talk about a lot of these issues on an intellectual level than how it is really, what it's like for people on a day-to-day basis, right? And what their motivations are on a day-to-day basis. We, on the right, many people in this room, we'd like to talk in terms of things like free markets. Our friends on the left talked about quite a bit during this election cycle about more abstract ideas about democracy and norms. But this that was clearly foregrounded by their campaign, but that's just not how the average voter is not thinking from a place of first principles. They're thinking in terms of something is off. Maybe there's just some actions or some policies that have caused things to be way off in terms of why am I paying so much more for groceries? Why does the border seem to be a mess? And those are, those are really kind of the motivating factors in this election. But I think from the perspective of there's a lot of conventional wisdom that Republicans need to change everything about and really downplay free markets in this new populist era. And that's not really true across the board. I went to a place, I talked about going to the Rio Grande Valley, and the ethic of the polling I did down there really asked people about what was the number one problem that they perceived with the Democratic Party. And the number one problem they perceived with the Democratic Party, the Hispanics in the Rio Grande Valley, was not necessarily this idea, these buzzwords about socialism, wasn't about woke ideology, wasn't really about cultural issues at all. What they were saying was, we think the Democrats are the party of welfare benefits for people who don't work. So there's very much of an ethic in that community of being able to, work your way up through your own hard work. We see a lot of people in our community, it's a very poor community, trying to game the system, to scam the system. Democrats seem to be trying to do things to make that easier for folks. So they're really voting their values, right? And it's values and work ethic are a huge, huge deal, I think, for members of this new coalition, who have, I think, instincts, right? Their instincts and how they live their day-to-day lives really align with those of conservatives, even though, I think they're not using the same terminology, right, about free markets and liberty and whatnot.
Tomorrow at 10 a.m., we have a session on reconnecting welfare to work and strengthening that relationship. So we'll talk about that. All right, over here, or in the middle, actually. Do we have a mic? Do you have a mic, Dennis? Okay, great.
Well, thank you for your remarks, and Avik, thanks for inviting us. So I'm a grandfather and a father, and my conclusion of the last election was that we rewarded bad behavior. So because it was successful, my question is, will future politicians in campaigns resort to insults and demeaning and dishonoring as a successful campaign strategy? Will we see other politicians do that?
Are you saying in this election we rewarded bad behavior? Or
I think he means that Trump has been, that's been Trump's style.
Absolutely. I mean, the style is going to be, I don't think other candidates will be quite like Trump, but the style, I think, that we're seeing being adapted even by Democrats in response to Trump, is more pugilistic, right, in terms of trying to do things to, throw him off balance. I remember the comment in the debate about talking about rally size and things like that, things that are totally unimportant. But it has been shown in many ways to be something that, got under his skin and took him off his game. And I think we'll see some, for better or worse, probably for worse, we'll probably see some version of that, not quite as extreme in future elections.
Are there any down ballot candidates, whether it's statewide or congressional races or senator or governor, that really struck you as very interesting in terms of being maybe a harbinger of how politics will evolve?
Yeah, I do think that, in particular, right, it's hard to see like how, you have had a lot of these candidates, right? The Republican coalition as a whole has gotten a whole lot more diverse, right, in terms of the bench of candidates. that it has put up in over the last few election cycles. And so, I'm old enough to remember, maybe there was one point in time that, Republicans didn't have a single Black conservative in elected office, right? That simply didn't happen. And now it's pretty commonplace. I think there were 14 Hispanic Republicans, several African Americans in elected office. And so I think that in many ways, the elected leadership, I think, is changing to become more diverse. And so I think that's only a positive sign.
One of the things that you mentioned in your book that I think is worth talking about here is you mentioned this point about how the Black conservatives of, say, the 1990s or the early 2000s, where they felt very isolated, and there was a sense of, to be a Black conservative, you had to go against all of your peers, and there was this massive peer pressure to not deviate from the group in that regard, and that there appears to be some sort of sociological tipping point where, when you get to a certain percentage of the electorate, where people can feel like, hey, I don't have to be a rebel against people like me in order to vote this way. There are lots of other people who think and speak like I do, that at some point, that's when things start to become more competitive. Can you talk about that a little bit and what you found?
I think this is specific to the Black community, which is really interesting in researching and reading into a lot of the academic literature on this. And it's something that we really are starting to see play out in these shifts, because clearly that is something that is clearly the area for most improvement for the right in terms of its coalition. But really the idea that the more embedded someone is within the Black community, going to the Black church, living in a neighborhood that has mostly you see mostly Black people around you. That is more than any policy, more than any narrative, even that the Democratic Party is putting out. Those are the voters, right, who are in most lockstep with the Democratic Party. And you have people who are maybe conservative on their values, and people have tested this experimentally.
They're the right wing of the Democratic Party, according to
exactly right. Where people who have
about this.
Pro Second Amendment views. If you live in a 80% Black community and have mostly Black friends, you vote very differently than if you live in a more integrated community. In that more integrated community, you are voting more in line with your values, in line with your ideological preferences, and you're voting more Republican. So I think one of the interesting things we saw a huge step forward among Black men specifically, but also among Black women. But the gains were unevenly distributed, right, within the Black community, if you look at the exit polls. And it really seemed to be almost an exponential growth curve, where the groups within the Black community who had lower levels of defection swung less, but they still swung, right? And the groups that had, like Black men who already had, I think maybe double-digit levels of support, now that's closer to 20%. So I'll be very interested to see, right, if we will continue to have this sort of exponential growth in that vote. But I think it's a tremendously important opportunity for folks on the right.
More questions?
Thank you. I'm in the state legislature in Utah, and so I've spent my year knocking doors for re-election. And I know one of the big issues people thought was going to be on the ballot was abortion. But as I knocked doors and talked to other moms, we were sharing ideas on clipping coupons and grocery prices. And so we've talked a lot about non-white working class Americans shifting towards the Republican Party. What happened with women? I'm curious. I know anecdotally it felt like more of them were focused on how to keep things affordable for their families, but I know that abortion was supposed to be one of the third most important issues. Can you speak to that?
I mean, it simply struck me as an issue that did not affect that many people, right? And particularly, I look at the shift among single women, the shift among young women, the groups that the Harris campaign was targeting very explicitly with this message. They swung more than married women. They swung more than older women. And so why is that? And I think it really ultimately shows, it's something that I saw all throughout in my focus group, that focus groups throughout the year, was that really the challenges that women specifically were facing with cost of living in the economy at the grocery store, really being the primary people dealing with the family budget. That was really the dominant issue, I think, for them, almost more so than among men, right? The men in my focus group almost seemed much more calm and more secure, and feeling like, that things are bad, but they're not, I'm not so mad about it. But it was really the proverbial kind of suburban women who were always the most, upset, really, and frustrated with the cost of living issue. And I think that's just really overshadowed all the other concerns, and it's borne out in the exit polls.
Just ask you, you described a little while ago about the black voters who sort of vote as a bloc in lockstep with the Democrats, with the Democratic Party, and it was the people, you said, black voters who go to church, and they're, and that's, they see the people who see just the blacks around them. My question is, why are they voting as a bloc with the Democratic Party?
I think it's something that started in the 1960s. Obviously, the 1964 election was something where you really started to see this pattern of 90+% support for the Democratic Party starting around the civil rights era. And it's surprising to a lot of people that has continued. I think that it clearly was a sense that was developed that, if we, because we had really, there was an experience in this country with, when we first started to vote, of bloc voting against us. So basically, I think there was this sense, in order to maximize the amount of political power and influence that we have to vote as a bloc for one party, and that's, kind of group interest politics 101. So that has started to break down a little bit, but it's still not quite where we are with Hispanic voters, or we're with Hispanic voters in this election.
Why has the Jewish vote been almost a bloc vote for the Democrats? Also, I mean, for many years, and I'm not sure why exactly or how that started.
And I will say that the exit polls are, there's some controversy about whether the exit polls are accurately reflecting what's actually happening there.
Yeah, I think with some of these smaller groups, I mean, it's hard to know ultimately, right? And in terms of Jewish voters are not necessarily a huge crosstab in our exit polls, right? Or if you're talking about 2 to 3% of the population, and so it's very hard. There were even estimates of, Trump won Native American voters, and maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but that's 1% of the electorate, or less than 1% of the electorate. So it's really sometimes hard to know, what's happening with some of these smaller groups. I would say in that situation, different sources of information had shifts, but where you have specific, I would say with more secular Jewish voters, they have remained strongly Democratic. But there are very specific Orthodox communities in New York, even I saw some in Detroit, that have swung in a really big way towards Trump over the last 2 cycles.
Were you able to do any takeaways on the character issue in this last election? So in past elections, the character issue would come up. You could imagine Trump voters saying, well, I think he's a man of low character, but he's for the things I'm for. You could imagine saying, well, I'm not sure about Harris's character. I can imagine them saying, I believe everything I saw in The Apprentice, and he's a man of great character. What did you take away in terms of how people view character and how they viewed the candidates' characters?
Yeah, so I think the number one thing people were looking for in this election was somebody who could bring about change, and somebody who was a strong leader. Those were the personal characteristics that I think really stood out, in voters' minds as they were making their decision. That was reflected in our polls. The traditional issues of moral character, moral rectitude have not seemed to enter into the equation very much in recent elections. But even just when we asked things along the lines of, do you want your president to have the right temperament or somebody who cares about people like you? Those types of, I'd say leadership attributes, personal traits were much less important, and those were the ones that Harris led on, whereas the most important things that people were actually voting on, even when they're not necessarily voting on the sort of character, quote unquote, they are looking for somebody who is a good fit, either personality-wise or leadership, in terms of their leadership abilities and style, beyond, just simply agreeing with them on the issues. And I think Trump was actually a good fit for a lot of voters this year on that basis.
I had a related question, Patrick, which is in the 2012 race between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, which I worked on, the takeaway from the exit polls that everyone used to talk about was that on the question of who cared about people like me, Obama won that group, won that question, something like 75, 25, 80, 20, something like that. In this election, on the exit poll, same question was asked, who cares more about people like you? And Kamala Harris won that question 75 to 25. That seems kind of counterintuitive based on everything else we've been talking about.
Right, because I think it's a misreading of what working class voters want. I think working class voters and voters overall, what they were prioritizing just much more strongly was this question of strong leadership. Right, they've seen the perception of, and a lot of this is you're really trying to, when you're hiring the next president, you're trying to fix the problems with the last president. And the perception, because of Biden's age, because of his the way he carries himself, and the fact that he had to exit the race, that he was obviously very advanced in age, but also that he was a weak leader, right? And Kamala Harris was not seen as much better on that front. So I think I was pretty confident Trump was going to win just based on two things, based on the fact that really he had leads, even though they were narrowed after the candidate switch on the top two issues, which were the economy and immigration, and he had leads on the top two leadership traits that people wanted to see, which was the change question and the strong leadership question.
Is there a last question out there?
My name is Kathleen Chandler, and I'm with the Independence Institute in Denver, Colorado. And you'd mentioned 2028 already. So my question is who? And then how do you see the massive amount of money that was spent? Even though, the Democrats outspent the Republicans, they still significantly lost. Even in my state of Colorado, which is extremely blue, we had a flip of a congressional seat where the candidate on the left spent an enormous amount of money and still lost.
I think there's a few things, right, happening on the money front. I'll address the money front. I don't want to get too much into 2028 politics right now. I think it's so, I think that, that is going to be so, that is going to change so many times before we even, there's going to be so many iterations of that discussion on the money front. There's an article in the New York Times this morning. Kamala Harris spent $1.5 billion in 15 weeks, and Democrats are wondering where the money went. Why did it go down the tubes? And I think, look, fundamentally, there were some very interesting patterns in that she spent far more than Trump. And yet they were competitive in terms of the ads that they were airing. And meanwhile, the Harris campaign seems to be spending tens of millions of dollars on staging these rallies and events, right, to make her seem more magnetic than she actually was. But I think it speaks to, I think at the presidential level, I think it speaks to, money only goes so far. I think as long as you have enough money to get a message across, and Trump certainly is somebody who has the ability to make a message get across in a way that, another another politician. He is uniquely skilled in that department, let's say. So he didn't need as much money to help his message get across. But I think if you were to talk to people involved in some of these down ballot races, some of the races for the House, look, I think it has to be a little bit disappointing for Republicans that they're going to have the very barest House majority on a popular vote advantage in the House of about 3.5 points. And a lot of people attribute that to, frankly, when you have these contests between normal-ish Republicans and normal-ish Democrats, Democrats really do have the advantage in some of these down ballot races, particularly when it comes to low dollar fundraising. And that has enabled them to outperform in a lot of these very competitive seats. So I think there's probably some evidence on both sides of that.
Patrick Ruffini, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Avik.